Hi, Chris. I'm Steve Burgess, and I'm working with Word Media, but I've also worked quite a lot with internal party organs to get things done. I asked you in the meeting. We didn't get into too much detail about it, probably because we were quite rushed, I think. But I asked you about the role of internal pressure groups, they might call them, such as JVL and Law, and the way that there seems to be never-ending guilt by association now. And the guilt by association leading to internal splits between people that should naturally be working together. And I gave the three examples of the JVL grouping, the law grouping as represented by perhaps Tony Greenstein, and a new Lazier grouping led by someone called Peter Gregson, as far as I can tell. Okay. Do you think that it's important that we scrutinise these claims and force these groups back together? Because essentially, the division that's occurring between them is actually leading to a huge amount of resentment in the movement and division there. I mean, do you think we can do more work in that regard?
Well, I think it's important to try and work in unity if and when we can. I mean, obviously, in certain circumstances, there are going to be differences of opinion. There's going to be technical splits in that sense, and I think having a debate is a healthy thing. You can have healthy disagreements, and that's kind of the nature of democracy in that sense. But I think it is incumbent upon us really to try and work together. This is one of the points I was making in a different context at the Parliamentary Labour Party a few weeks or months and now it is ago, where I was making the case that, look, we're all Labour Party MPs. We all joined the party, I'd like to think, and stood for Parliament to try and promote social justice and ethical foreign policy and so on. And let's try and, we're going to have differences of opinion, but let's find ways of working together. So it's not always going to be possible, and we have to be realistic about that. But I think wherever we can, all of us, it's incumbent upon us to do our best to try and work together, because that old Labour movement maxim about unity of strength is absolutely apposite, really. And whenever we are falling out with each other, we're letting essentially the sort of establishment, the powers that be, those that really do wield power in the country, we're letting them off the hook.
So, specific in terms of concrete nuts and bolts, how do we stop falling out with each other?
I'm not saying that we stop falling out with each other, because an inevitable consequence, I suppose, of democracy is discussion, is argument, and there will be disagreements, and people will sometimes fall out with each other. It's how we kind of move beyond that. I think you can have an honest. I'd like to hope anyway that we can have an honest disagreement. But this is where I think democracy comes in, and once a decision is taken, you kind of have to kind of go along and abide by the majority view, in my opinion. And if you feel you can't do that, well, this is where sometimes things can get a little difficult, and sometimes people take the bat and ball away and absent themselves. And we've seen that, obviously a lot of people. I mean, I stuck with the Labour Party. I joined in 1976, and I stuck with Labour through the new Labour years. I think we did some decent things. I think we made a lot of mistakes, and we lost, a huge opportunity to do a lot more. But other people, particularly after the Iraq War, for example, felt that was just a step too far, and they decided to leave. And that was an honourable decision. What I think is unhelpful and not really acceptable is where we then start kind of attacking each other publicly and trying to undermine each other. We need, if there is a disagreement that you feel you're unable to reconcile that and stay within the organisation, I think the honourable thing to do in those circumstances is to simply kind of resign, as it were. And I think that, again, coming back to that point about unity is strength. I think you can have the discussion and then get behind the decision, and if you feel unhappy with that, just bite your lip. And if you can't do that, then I think the only other course of action is to leave. But to have these internal kind of continual public falling outs, it's unhelpful.
Yeah. What do you think of the importance? I mean, obviously there's been a lot of debate, and I'm keen to push this further than just the big public issue of anti-Semitism. I'm keen to push it into sort of real realms and territory of the deal with, say, transphobia and misogyny as well, because these are all kinds of smears that are used to generate division in the movement. I don't know if it's deliberate or it's accidental or what it is, but what do you think the role of definitions are in this, and how important do you think they are?
Well, I mean, I think for some people they are important, but for me, I would just refer back to, I think, a comment that Jeremy was making the other day, really. He was talking about, I don't think he was talking specifically about the point that you've raised, but he was making the distinction between tolerance and respect, and he said it's not about tolerating different people, different, backgrounds, faiths, whatever. It's about respecting people, and I think if we can kind of embrace that notion of respect, I think that would take us a long way down the road of moving the movement on and avoiding some of these unseemly fallouts that we've seen, which has scarred the movement over the last few years.
So, would it be correct to characterise you as somebody who thinks that definitions aren't really that substantially important?
I mean, I don't know whether I thought about it that deeply. To be honest with you, my view is that we should respect people, we shouldn't judge people, and I think if you can have that kind of non-judgmental attitude and you can respect people, then I think that will carry you a long way in terms of avoiding some of the difficulties that we've found ourselves in over the last few years or so.
Well, non-judgmental is a little bit of a step back from what the movement has to do, isn't it? I mean, doesn't the movement at some point have to say this person's crossed a line in some cases? Well,
maybe, yeah, true. I mean, as I say, there will be certain circumstances, but I mean, people who join, the movement, generally, you'd like to think, they are kind of like-minded people. They join because they want to, they want to fight for social justice. They want to bring about, an ethical foreign policy on the international stage in that sense. But yeah, sometimes, people, potentially do step over the line. That's why you have rules in the party. To deal with that. But, they should be used sparingly, in my view, and not be the first sort of point of call to suggest that people be, expelled or whatever. Because sometimes people, articulate in certain ways that it's more through ignorance, really, than malice. And I think this notion of, trying to understand and then trying to sort of work with people, and to have this kind of collective, supportive sort of approach, really, rather than sort of judging people and calling people out in that very kind of overt way. Sometimes, particularly with social media these days, there's this sense of quick to judge and dogpile and demonise people when they may have made a foolish comment, and fine to call them out for that, but to work with people, try and, sort of help people, to grow in that sense, because, I remember speaking to a young person who's very active in the Labour Party now, but they were saying, coming from a working class background, and they were saying initially, when they first started taking an interest in things, they were initially attracted by the kind of far-right rhetoric, and it was only through talking to others, and there was a local Labour councillor who got involved in the local boxing club, where he was a member, and started some of the kind of political discussions and kind of raising consciousness in that sense, that he realised the error of his ways. But if you were to kind of just demonise and that individual, we may have lost him forever. And he's a great man. I don't want to name the guy, but he's a hugely important figure in my opinion, in his own constituency, and has made a massive contribution. There'll be thousands of people, millions of people potentially like that out there. We need to be building this movement in all its diversity in that sense, and bringing people in rather than kind of trying to keep people out.
Absolutely, I entirely agree with the broad church approach, and I think it's very important that we bring these separate, disparate and factional groups together, especially within the left. I mean, it's one thing saying that factional is it's one thing labelling things factional, but typically people that do that, I think, and I hope you'd agree with this, often misunderstand the reason that factions emerge. Factions emerge often for fundamental reasons. Moving to a slightly different subject area, what do you think about the way the movement selects its NEC and its national officers in terms of inside the party?
I mean, I think there's probably potentially room for improvement there. I think there's probably a case for a greater proportion of the national executive to reflect the growth in party membership. There has been some movement in that direction. I do very much agree with the one-member, one-vote approach that we have to elect the constituency delegates to the National Executive Committee. I think there's probably a case, this is something the trade union movement need to consider, in my view, about the trade unions moving to one member, one vote, so that ordinary rank and file grassroots members of the trade unions have a role in selecting their representative who sits on the Labour Party National Executive Committee. I think that's something that, in my opinion, it would be good if the trade union movement were to embrace that approach, but that's something that needs to be discussed inside the trade union movement.
Okay, so make this a final question now, because there's someone else waiting to ask you important questions. But so would you also agree that because it's not just about trade unions, but it's also about internal pressure groups, for example, Momentum, CLPD, LRC, it's a whole series of them, and of course the overarching organisation there, which is called CLGA. How do you think CLGA should approach its elections?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking really there in terms of forming a slate for the, a left slate in that sense for the constituency section of the NEC election, which is a kind of slightly informal arrangement, obviously, and I was talking more about the kind of formal structures and the way in which we, as a movement, as a party, select and elect people to go onto the National Executive Committee. In terms of that informal arrangement, I do think there is a desire, and indeed, in my view, a need to make that a more democratic process, because I think there's been a degree of dissatisfaction that's been articulated to me from grassroots members about how the slate last time, and indeed for that matter the time before that, was actually formulated. I haven't got any kind of small answer to what the solution is, but I think the present arrangement is one that is a source of dissatisfaction, and that's troubling, because I think we need unity in that regard, and we need unity around the slate, and so I think it's important, therefore, that we do, the organisations involved in that process look at that and try and find a better way, a more democratic way of involving grassroots members more in helping to determine how we ended up formulating the slate, rather than it being left to a handful of individuals. That leaves, as I say, people feeling that they've been a bit railroaded, and as I say, there is some dissatisfaction that's built up as a consequence of that.
Last question before I hand over. Sorry, what is a trope?
That's a good question.
It's a gotcha question, and I'm not expecting you to be able to answer it, but I'll throw it in there anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that.
If you don't know, just say no.
I'll take. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a range of probable definitions. I don't necessarily want to hazard my own. I know it's a term that's used. I don't think it's a particularly helpful term, to be honest with you. And I think if you spoke to a lot of people throughout the country, working class, middle class, you name it, speak to a range of different people, I think a lot of people would be not quite sure what that is either. And so I think it's really important that we're clear with our language and we don't use sort of jargony terms